The so-called strategic hamlets became a despised symbol of the Diem regime and were targeted for attack by guerrillas, their prisoners freed. Leading the charge was a group calling itself the National Liberation Front, and by dismantling the camps, which by 1963 held 67% of the rural population, the NLF were making serious gains and were approaching majority control of the countryside. The NLF, what the Western press refers to as the Viet Cong, initially sought a nonviolent political strategy, but following the introduction of Diem's concentration camps and 1059 Edict, the guerrillas mounted an organized, widespread, and popularly supported rebellion. The NLF's Liberation Army was organized into two principal groups of combatants, a main force organized into companies and battalions in standard army fashion, and irregular paramilitaries. These local forces were farmers by day and guerrillas by night, and engaged in combat whenever they had a military advantage. The guerrilla farmers were the pool from which assassination teams, volunteer grenade throwers, and saboteurs were drawn. In order to seize and then control territory, that territory's administration had to be replaced by the administration of the NLF, and the way to do that was to liquidate them. Targeting the state-appointed village chiefs, the insurgency killed an estimated 4,000 from 1960 to 1961 alone. A captured military document tells fighters to, quote, carry out assassination missions right at the center to immobilize the enemy. Prime targets should be security forces and civil action district officials, hooligans, and thugs. After working tirelessly to peel the lid off the insurgency and embarrassing the United States with his suppression of Buddhists, Diem was finally seen as too costly to keep around. So, with the authorization of Ambassador Lodge, Diem was shot and then stabbed in the heart by a military assassin inside of a car. By then, the NLF controlled most of the countryside, and they showed no sign of slowing down. They ambushed and attacked South Vietnamese military and police outposts, and seized their American weapons, which, as we'll see, they were becoming heavily armed with. And it wasn't only outposts either. By 1964, the Liberation Army had become capable of wiping out entire units of Saigon troops, or about 100 men. But it wasn't often that they were able to take out entire battalions, which numbered between 500 and 700 troops. Nevertheless, in 1964, they managed to wipe out 8 of them. Toward the end of the year, the fighting escalated when NLF forces commenced a series of attacks on Saigon troops, and in December, they would wipe out 2.5 battalions out of just 11 in the Strategic Reserves, an elite U.S.-trained force, which by 1965 had virtually ceased to exist. The garrisons manning the small outposts and watchtowers fled in fear, and the ones that did remain were spared by supplying arms to the guerrillas. A standard price for a month's survival was 10,000 rounds of ammunition a month. As in Iraq, Vietnam became overflowing with weaponry, but not from the weapons depots that were already there. It was the Americans who were supplying their enemy. Wilfred Burchett, who lived among Vietnamese communists in South Vietnam for 6 months during the war, described in detail the degree to which the Americans were supplying them. When one looked at a regular soldier of the front, the extent of U.S. gifts became even more impressive. His standard arm is the U.S. carbine, but a percentage of his comrades in arms will be carrying Garands, Tommy guns, 37mm machine guns, a variety of bazookas and mortars, and in battalion-size units, a few of the highly appreciated 57mm recoilless cannon. Indeed, Lyndon B. Johnson's massive escalation of the war and the subsequent increase in military equipment and arms only made the problem worse. America's guys, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, and the Government of Vietnam, or GVN, were some of the biggest sources of their arms. And by selling them off to make personal fortunes, the South Vietnamese government was furnishing the communists with more weapons than were arriving from Hanoi. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson authorized a surge of hundreds of thousands of troops, which would peak at over 500,000 by 1968. With more U.S. troops came more U.S. casualties, and in 1966, already over 6,000 Americans were killed. The Liberation Forces had the advantage of a vast network of spies and extensive popular support from the rural population. They were also in their native territory. Marine Captain John G. Miller would recount some of the challenges faced by Americans in Vietnam. The constant heavy rains of the wet monsoon can swell rifle stocks to the point where the trigger cannot be depressed completely, and where disassembly and assembly are out of the question. Rust and corrosion of metal surfaces are, of course, accompanying side effects. Their heavy gear was also a huge setback. A Marine wearing a flak jacket will not match the cross-country speed of a guerrilla who is not wearing one. Captain Francis West of the 9th Marines would agree. Each rifleman carried 150 rounds of ammunition and 2 or more hand grenades. The men of the 2 machine gun crews were strapped with belts of linked cartridges totaling 1,200 rounds. The platoon moved out at 1100. There was no breeze and no shade. The temperature was 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 5 minutes, every Marine was soaked in sweat. Soldiers were no doubt scared, ill-equipped to fight an enemy who vanished into thin air when confronted. Jungle shadows. It didn't help that the NLF had created a whole life underground, building extremely impressive networks of tunnels, with some containing kitchens, with dispersed horizontal ventilation tunnels leading some distance away in order to avoid detection from aircraft. Many tunnels were reinforced and sealed with concrete. Some even opened up underneath streams or canals. The base area at Cu Chi contained nearly 200 miles of tunnels. There were storage rooms for weapons or rice, or even small clinics. Tunnels near the surface led up to hundreds of firing posts. Wilfred Burchett, the Western journalist who lived with the NLF, described some of these firing posts. I was taken to inspect a single clump of bamboo and told to look very carefully for anything suspicious among the roots. I found nothing. Then I was taken into the tunnel and to a firing position which could accommodate 3 or 4 people. Someone took a stick and poked it through what seemed to be blind slits with earthen gun rests behind them. Impossible for anyone to detect at even a few yards. Other firing positions which I inspected were also perfectly camouflaged, and as the guerrillas changed places constantly, even if the gun flash or smoke gave a position away, it would be little use firing at it. Indeed, Burchett was with the Liberation Army while they engaged in a firefight with enemy forces. The guerrillas fired, then rushed to positions parallel to the line of flight and fired again, moving with incredible speed through the undergrowth and firing all the time. No amount of American assistance in Indochina can conquer an enemy which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere. An enemy of the people, which has the sympathy and support of the people. Since the Liberation Forces were so elusive, many US troops were put in the uncomfortable position of leading with their chins, which is exactly what the guerrillas wanted them to do. They'd react in one of a few ways, including leading them on a wild goose chase and ambushing them. Indeed, ambushes with small arms fire accounted for many deaths of GIs. But there were other concerns, namely booby traps. Made by NLF troops and even villagers, but pioneered by the minority tribes of Vietnam such as the Kor, Manang, and Ede, these death traps have become a hallmark of the war in Vietnam, much like the IEDs from Iraq. Trapdoors on trails led to a bed of bamboo punji spikes. Spiked beams swung from door frames, and giant flying medieval-style maces, made by stuffing clay into a basket with spikes sticking out of it, were just some of their creative undertakings. These weapons are legendary, and like the IEDs of Iraq, a huge blow to morale, since their distribution and ubiquity could only mean one thing, that they were made with the full knowledge and even support of much of the population. Indigenous tribes also used homemade crossbows, shooting poisoned arrows which paralyzed and killed, spreading terror amongst the South Vietnamese forces. One particularly gnarly invention, as observed by Wilfred Burchett, was the spiking of rice paddies in order to target marauding government troops. The spikes are set in rigid lengths of bamboo and planted deep in the rice field slush. Wounds inflicted in the rice field slush were particularly serious because of the human and pig excrement lavishly used as manure. Amputations were almost the only answer to infections from such wounds. A rough way of fighting, one may well comment, but so was the attempt to starve out the tribal people by destroying their food crops. But IEDs aren't just a relic of Iraq, they were used liberally in Vietnam as well. By rigging mines to explode via tripwires or electronic detonation, IEDs were among the most deadly and effective weapons against the American occupation. In fact, the first US soldier killed in action in Vietnam was hit by an anti-personnel mine. As in Korea, flooding the country with landmines proved to have a disastrous blowback effect which killed scores of Americans. In fact, mines would account for 33% of all US casualties in Vietnam, along with 28% of deaths. Individual units suffered even greater losses. The 1st Marine Division reported that 57% of their casualties were from mines and booby traps during the latter half of 1968. In 1967, mines and booby traps caused 4,300 US casualties. In 1968, that number jumped to 5,800. We suspect that the figures attributed to mines are low. It is probable that the classification of fragmentation casualties, which we have not counted, contains the results of many mines and booby trap incidents. Several divisions have reported, for example, that about half of their hostile casualties are inflicted by mines and booby traps. On August 6, 1970, Gordon Weiss would feel the sting of an anti-personnel mine on a routine patrol, writing in a letter to his family, quote, "Assumed you'd heard what happened to me. To make matters short, I was walking point for my platoon, somewhere around 10 in the morning. I hit a booby trap. It was a pressure release type mine, therefore it was easily camouflaged and rough to spot. I lost most of my left leg and my left hand. I'll write when I have the chance." Weiss wouldn't get the chance. He died 2 days later from his injuries. We kill more Americans with our own mines than we do anyone else. And the Pentagon knew this for years. By 1969, the Pentagon admitted, at least internally, that most mines were American-made. The enemy uses a very limited number of Soviet and Chinese communist mines. The majority are fabricated locally in village or district munition factories from US duds and refuse. 90% of all mine and booby trap components are US origin. Indeed, on any given year, American bombing could leave behind more than 20,000 tons of unexploded ordnance. And after these air raids, volunteers could retrieve these bombs and begin the dangerous process of creating booby traps with them. One stop in Wilfred Burchett's journey with the Vietnamese communists was a fully functioning bomb factory. Laboratories housed bamboo huts lined with US parachute nylon. Girls with delicate balances were weighing the minuscule quantities of explosives necessary for various types of detonator caps. Lathes, generators, boring and polishing machines, all of them American, were in underground dugouts. Before being killed by a landmine himself, Gordon Weiss eerily described life in the mine-infested jungle. "Mines are a horrible, senseless device that do nothing more than slow us down. We'd rather take on 1,000 in a firefight than have to walk through a known minefield."